The moment you chase validation, you signal that you can be steered. Rivals do not need to attack you directly. They only need to notice what you crave. If you have ever adjusted your tone, softened a position, or waited anxiously for a reaction, you have already revealed leverage. Approval is not neutral. It is information. It tells others where your stability depends on response. And once that dependence is visible, your edge dulls. You begin to calculate instead of decide, to anticipate instead of assert. What feels like social awareness quietly becomes self-editing. There are mechanisms beneath validation that most people never examine. Patterns that reward alignment and quietly punish friction. Once you see them, you start to understand why seeking approval rarely builds respect. There is a moment most people recognize, even if they never name it. You share an opinion and wait a fraction of a second too long to see how it lands. You post something not because you needed to say it, but because you wanted to be seen saying it. You adjust your tone, your posture, your words, not to be understood but to be accepted. It feels harmless. It feels human, and that is the point. The need for approval did not begin as a flaw. Long before systems or institutions, acceptance meant survival. To belong was to be protected. To be rejected was to be exposed. Your nervous system still carries that memory. Social exclusion still registers as threat. So when you feel the pull toward validation, nothing is wrong with you. You are responding exactly as you were designed to. What changed is the environment. The world no longer requires approval to keep you alive. It uses it to keep you aligned. There was no announcement, no rule declared. Approval simply became currency, gradually, quietly, until the exchange felt normal. You give a little of yourself, your edge, your doubt, your instinct to challenge. In return, you receive reassurance, visibility, belonging. Because the trade is never stated outright, it feels like a gift instead of a bargain. This is the silent exchange: approval for obedience, recognition for alignment, safety for self-censorship. No one forces you into it. That is why it works. Authority no longer needs to command. It waits. It rewards the right signals and withholds attention from the rest. Over time, the lesson embeds itself. You learn what is applauded. You learn what creates discomfort. You learn what keeps you visible. Eventually, you stop noticing that you are learning at all. The unsettling part is not that people seek approval. It is that approval now shapes identity. Opinions are curated instead of examined. Beliefs are performed instead of tested. Even dissent is often pre-approved, packaged to remain safe and legible. The most effective systems do not tell you who to be. They convince you that who you already are is only acceptable under certain conditions. At first it feels empowering. You feel seen, included, but there is a quiet cost. A sense that something essential has been softened, that your instincts hesitate where they once moved freely. You begin to outsource your sense of self. Am I right or am I approved? Am I honest or am I rewarded? Am I thinking or am I repeating? Most people never sit with these questions. They adapt instead. They tell themselves this is maturity. That influence requires consensus. That visibility requires compromise. But something important is hidden in that logic. Authority was once claimed through conviction, through clarity, through the willingness to stand alone if necessary. Now it is surrendered slowly, one small concession at a time, until you no longer remember where it went. The most unsettling part is not that the bargain exists. It is that it feels voluntary. You click, you agree, you nod along, and because no one is restraining you, it feels like freedom. But the moment approval becomes necessary, independence becomes dangerous. The moment validation becomes fuel, dissent becomes risk. Not because someone will punish you, but because something will be withdrawn: attention, belonging, relevance, and so authority is not taken from you. It is handed over, quietly, politely, one choice at a time. This is where the story actually begins. Long before validation became a metric, it was a lifeline. In early human groups, belonging was not emotional. It was physical. To be accepted meant access to food, shelter, protection, and shared vigilance. To be rejected meant exposure, isolation, in many cases, death. Your nervous system was built in that environment, and it still carries that memory. That is why approval calms you, why disapproval spikes anxiety, why even mild social rejection can feel disproportionate. Your body is not reacting to a comment or a glance. It is reacting to an ancient signal of exile. But there is an important distinction that modern conversations about validation often miss. Approval was not pursued, it emerged. In tribal settings, status belonged to those who demonstrated reliability under pressure. The hunter who returned with food, the lookout who noticed danger first, the person who stayed steady when others panicked. Their authority was not negotiated, it was recognized. Certainty signaled safety. Groundedness signaled competence. People did not follow the most agreeable person. They followed the most dependable one. Validation was scarce, tied to contribution and consequence. Because it was scarce, it mattered. It conveyed real information about your place in the group. That structure is inverted. Today, validation is abundant, constant, and engineered. Likes, reactions, engagement, approval signals delivered at scale. Detached from competence, detached from truth, detached from consequence. Affirmation without risk, without depth, without responsibility. And your brain does not know the difference. The same neural circuits that once tracked your standing in a survival group now track metrics, designed to hold attention and shape behavior. A mechanism built for survival has been repurposed for influence. This is not weakness. It is biology meeting an environment it was never designed for. When validation becomes easy, it becomes addictive. Not because it feels good, but because it temporarily quiets uncertainty. Each signal reassures the nervous system. You are not alone, you are safe. For a moment, the relief fades. So the system offers more. Gradually, the question shifts from "is this true?" to "will this be accepted?" That is the hinge. The danger is not wanting validation. Everyone does. The danger begins when validation stops being information and becomes identity. When approval determines not just how you feel, but who you are allowed to be. At that point, self-trust erodes. Convictions soften before they are tested. Alignment comes before reflection. Not because anyone orders it, but because the cost of deviation feels quietly threatening. A survival instinct becomes a lever. This is where power enters. When systems understand that people will reorganize themselves to avoid rejection, control no longer requires force. It requires incentives, visibility for alignment, silence for deviation, reward for repetition, absence for independence. The primitive brain responds immediately. The rational mind arrives later, if at all. Understanding this does not make you immune, but it gives you something rare. The ability to notice when a biological instinct is being used to guide you away from your own authority. And once you see that, the question underneath validation changes. Not, do they approve of me? But, who benefits if I need them to? There is a common illusion about authority. Most people imagine it as something you acquire. A title, a platform, a following, a visible signal that tells others you deserve attention. But authority does not usually work that way. Watch two people in the same room. One speaks often, explains themselves carefully, tracks reactions while talking, adjusts tone mid-sentence. Their words are polished, responsive, calibrated. They want to be understood. They want agreement. The other speaks less. When they do, they are direct. No disclaimers, no preemptive clarification, no scanning the room for permission. Their presence feels settled even in silence. Most people orient toward the second person, not because they dominate the space, but because they are not negotiating their right to occupy it. Authority is not announced, it is felt. Humans constantly scan for stability. We register who is grounded, who is uncertain, and who is adapting in real time to be accepted. These judgments happen beneath conscious thought, through posture, timing, tone, and restraint. The moment someone seeks validation, something shifts. Approval seeking communicates dependence. It says implicitly, my position exists only if you confirm it. And once that signal is sent, authority weakens. Because authority cannot rely on permission. This is why real influence looks effortless from the outside. People who have it rarely over-explain. They do not crowd ideas with justifications. They do not chase consensus in every exchange. They assume their right to speak, and others respond to that assumption. Uncertainty invites testing. When someone overdefends, seeks reassurance, or performs openness to approval, others instinctively probe. Not maliciously, curiously. They want to see where the line is, whether the position holds. Often it doesn't. This creates an unspoken hierarchy in everyday interactions, in meetings, in conversations, online. Those who need agreement remain reactive. Those who don't quietly set the frame. The paradox is simple. The more you try to be accepted, the more you place yourself beneath the group you want approval from. You respond instead of define. You adjust instead of anchor. Validation keeps you visible, but it never makes you authoritative. This has nothing to do with arrogance or detachment. Authority is not indifference. It is internal anchoring, a sense of legitimacy that does not rise and fall with reaction. Because of that stability, words carry weight. People trust positions that appear stable. This is why authority cannot be claimed. The moment you say, "Listen to me," you've already surrendered leverage. The moment you ask to be taken seriously, you reveal uncertainty about whether you should be. Real authority is assumed internally first, then mirrored externally. Online, the pattern is even clearer. Watch credibility erode when someone chases engagement, explains endlessly in comments, defends every point, responds to every challenge. Certainty becomes performance. Contrast that with those who speak plainly, infrequently, and do not chase reaction. Their restraint becomes part of their influence. Silence does not weaken them. It strengthens the projection. The relationship between validation and authority is inverse. Every time you look outward to confirm your position, you weaken it. Every time you hesitate unless approval is guaranteed, you reinforce a subordinate role. Authority grows where negotiation ends, not because feedback is ignored, but because the source of the stance is internal. And when a position comes from clarity rather than consensus, it remains intact even under pressure. That is when people follow. Not because you asked, but because you never needed to. There is a cost to needing approval that rarely shows on the surface. From the outside, a person can look successful, respected, even admired. They say the right things. They move easily through social spaces. They're praised for being thoughtful, articulate, agreeable. And yet, internally, something is always tightening. Because when approval becomes necessary, the mind never rests. Every interaction turns into an evaluation. What did they think of that? Did I say too much? Not enough? Should I clarify? Should I adjust next time? Attention splits between experience and performance. You are present, but also watching yourself be present. This is where anxiety quietly takes root. Not the dramatic kind, the low-grade kind, the constant hum of self-monitoring. The tension of never being fully off stage, of filtering instinct through prediction before it's allowed to exist. Over time, this becomes automatic. You stop noticing the pause before you speak, the softening of opinions, the careful phrasing. It feels like maturity, like social intelligence, like being considerate. But there is a difference between awareness and dependence. When validation replaces self-trust, identity fragments. You become many versions of yourself, each tuned to a different audience. None of them feel solid because none of them originate from the inside. This creates a subtle dissonance. People respond well to you, but the response never lands. Praise feels thin. Compliments fade quickly. You are seen, but not anchored. Admired, but not known. Because you know you are not showing your full position, only what survives approval. Authority cannot grow here. Authority begins with self-trust, with the ability to sense what is true for you before it is echoed by others. When that signal is drowned out by constant external reference, confidence becomes performative. Conviction becomes borrowed, and borrowed conviction is fragile. When feedback shifts, the ground shifts with it. Doubt rushes in. You don't just question the reaction, you question the belief itself. Should I rethink this? Should I reposition? The cycle is exhausting. It produces people who are highly adaptive but internally unstable, constantly updating themselves yet never arriving. Praised for openness, quietly afraid to stand still. This dynamic is especially useful to larger systems. A person who needs approval is easy to guide, not because they are foolish, but because they are attentive. They sense tone shifts quickly. They adjust early. Their nervous system performs alignment without being asked. No coercion is required. Validation dependence creates predictability, and predictability is the foundation of control. When identity is organized around acceptance, dissent becomes rare not because it's punished, but because it feels internally dangerous. Standing alone triggers the old fear of rejection. So convictions are diluted before they're ever tested. This is how authority erodes from the inside, not through force but through fatigue. Not through censorship, but through self-censorship. Not through fear, but through anticipation. The most unsettling part is that it often feels like progress. You become more polished, more fluent, more socially aware. And somewhere along the way, you stop asking a simple question: do I actually believe this? That realization isn't an accusation. It's an invitation to notice. Notice when you check the room before checking yourself. Notice how often certainty depends on response. Notice how rarely an idea is allowed to stand without imagining how it will be received. These patterns don't mean you failed. They mean you're human in an environment that rewards compliance. But authority, real authority, cannot emerge from this loop. It requires tolerating disapproval without collapse, remaining intact without agreement, trusting your internal signal long enough for it to stand on its own. Until then, validation will keep feeling like oxygen. And despite all the affirmation, something essential will continue to feel missing. When you step back far enough, a pattern comes into focus. Modern systems of power rarely rely on suppression. They don't need to. Silencing voices is inefficient. It creates resistance. It draws attention. It signals fear. Redirecting desire is far more effective. Validation has become one of the most precise tools ever developed for this purpose. Not because it forces behavior, but because it rewards it. Attention is no longer just feedback. It is currency. And validation is the paycheck. This quietly changes how influence operates. Platforms, algorithms, and cultural incentives are not built to discover truth. They are built to amplify engagement. Whatever provokes reaction rises. Whatever holds attention spreads. Whatever aligns with existing sentiment is reinforced. Over time, a feedback loop forms. Ideas that trigger approval are elevated. Ideas that create friction are not banned or erased. They are simply buried, made invisible. The system doesn't tell you what to think. It shows you what gets rewarded, and the human nervous system adapts quickly. When people notice that certain positions attract affirmation, visibility, and social reinforcement, they drift toward them. Not always consciously, often instinctively. Visibility feels like safety. Silence feels like risk. This is how narratives stabilize. Authority figures in this environment are not necessarily those with depth or clarity. They are those whose positions are constantly reinforced. Confidence begins to look legitimate, not because it is coherent, but because it is repeated. The signal becomes its own proof. When enough people echo the same stance, it starts to feel inevitable. Not because it's correct, but because deviation feels lonely. Power doesn't need to punish dissent here. It only needs to exhaust it. Dissenting voices are rarely silenced outright. Instead, they're surrounded, pulled into reaction cycles, debated endlessly, clipped, reframed, diluted. The original position dissolves into noise, and the person behind it learns a lesson. Speaking clearly without reinforcement feels destabilizing, so they adapt. They sharpen for reaction, simplify for approval, perform without meaning to. This isn't censorship, it's saturation. Validation seeking aligns people with system-approved narratives because misalignment carries a constant, low-grade cost. Reduced visibility, loss of relevance, absence of feedback, a subtle sense of being out of step. The hunger for recognition does the rest. This is why modern power feels invisible. It doesn't issue commands. It shapes incentives. It doesn't dictate belief. It rewards certain expressions of belief. Over time, people internalize the logic. They begin filtering their own thoughts before they're spoken. Not because they're told to, but because they've learned which thoughts survive. Attention becomes the arbiter of truth. A psychological economy emerges. Every opinion enters a market. Some circulate, others stall. Circulation is mistaken for authority. Silence is mistaken for irrelevance. But circulation is not substance. The nervous system doesn't care. Validation feels like confirmation. Lack of it feels like error. So tone shifts. Language converges. Certainty is performed even when understanding is thin. Resonance replaces coherence, and the system runs smoothly. The darkest part is how ordinary this feels. There is no villain, no central planner, just incentives interacting with biology. People believe they are expressing themselves freely, and in a sense they are. But the range of expression is shaped long before the choice is made. Power no longer needs to silence voices. It only needs to reward the right ones. Those who understand this move deliberately. Those who don't mistake visibility for authority and approval for truth. And slowly, almost imperceptibly, authority is redefined. No longer grounded in clarity, courage, or insight, but in reinforcement, in numbers, in applause, in validation. This is how a survival instinct becomes an economic engine. And this is why stepping outside the validation economy is not just a personal act, it is a political one. One of the most comforting myths in modern culture is the idea that visibility equals resistance. That speaking loudly is the same as speaking freely. That controversy signals independence. That if something provokes outrage or applause, it must be challenging power. It rarely is. Power is not threatened by noise. It is threatened by indifference to reward. True nonconformity has never been glamorous. It is quiet. It is isolating. And most of the time, it is ignored. Not because it lacks force, but because it refuses to perform. Curated rebellion looks very different. It has a recognizable aesthetic, familiar language, predictable targets. It signals dissent in ways that are immediately legible and easily categorized. Most importantly, it is rewarded. It attracts attention, allies, and a ready-made sense of belonging. This is where rebellion becomes safe. When dissent is validated, amplified, and reinforced, it stops being disruptive. It becomes another lane within the system, a sanctioned outlet for frustration that never threatens the underlying structure. Reaction is mistaken for resistance. Impact is measured by engagement, by outrage, by affirmation from those who already agree. Convictions harden not through reflection, but through applause. Over time, the dissenter becomes just as dependent on validation as the narrative they oppose. The system doesn't resist this, it benefits from it. Performative dissent keeps energy circulating without changing direction. It gives people the feeling of agency while preserving predictability. You are allowed to disagree loudly, as long as you do so in familiar ways. Genuine nonconformity is harder to spot. It doesn't announce itself as rebellion. It doesn't seek response or permission. It moves according to internal clarity regardless of reception. And that makes it costly. True independence risks invisibility, misunderstanding, standing alone without reinforcement. There is no immediate feedback loop to reassure you that you're right, relevant, or aligned with history, which is why so few people choose it. It is easier to adopt positions that come with built-in applause, to oppose one narrative by aligning perfectly with another, to trade one audience for a different one and call it independence. This is how dissent becomes a mirror of conformity. Different slogans, same dependence. The uncomfortable question is not whether you oppose authority, it is whether you need to be seen opposing it. If conviction weakens when approval fades, if certainty depends on reaction, then rebellion is still organized around validation. It may feel defiant, but structurally it is compliant. This is not a moral judgment, it is a structural observation. Most people do not fear being wrong, they fear being alone. So approval is simply rerouted. One source replaces another, and nothing fundamental changes. Authority does not shift when validation changes hands. It shifts when someone acts without reference to it. This is why the most disruptive ideas often arrive quietly, without branding, without outrage, without instant consensus. They move slowly, carried by people willing to hold them without reinforcement. These people rarely look like rebels. They look grounded, calm, slightly out of step. They are not performing resistance. They are living it, and that is precisely why they are difficult to absorb. This section is not an accusation, it is an invitation to ask whether your beliefs feel true in silence, whether you would hold them without applause, whether you would keep thinking the same way if no one noticed. Because the moment validation becomes the measure of rebellion, rebellion becomes performance. And performance, no matter how loud, rarely threatens power. Only independence does. History is not kind to those who chase approval in real time. It rarely remembers who was celebrated early, widely affirmed, or perfectly aligned with public sentiment. Those figures tend to dissolve into the atmosphere that produced them, loud in their moment, indistinguishable afterward. The people history returns to are different. They are often quiet at first, peripheral, misunderstood, sometimes dismissed entirely. Not because they lacked clarity, but because their clarity did not align with the mood of their time. They did not move with consensus. They moved with conviction. What unites these figures is not heroism or perfection, but orientation. Their decisions did not pivot on approval. Their thinking did not wait for permission. They acted from an internal axis that remained steady, even when response was hostile or absent. As a result, their authority was rarely obvious while they were alive. They were resisted, questioned, ridiculed, often ignored. Not because they were wrong, but because they were early. Because what they embodied could not yet be recognized as legitimate. Real authority does not always announce itself in the present tense. It accumulates slowly, through coherence, through consistency, through the ability to remain intact under pressure. Others begin to orient around it, not because it demands attention, but because it does not collapse without it. This is why so many figures we now respect were once seen as inconvenient. Their ideas created friction. Their presence disrupted assumptions. They did not fit neatly into existing systems of approval, and they paid for that. Not always with dramatic consequences, but with isolation, with obscurity, with long stretches of being misunderstood. They operated without the reassurance modern culture treats as essential. What sustained them was not certainty of recognition, it was certainty of alignment. History eventually caught up, but only after time filtered out what was reactive and amplified what was stable. Only after applause faded and substance remained. This stands in sharp contrast to modern validation culture. Today, authority is often assumed instantly. A voice rises quickly, gathers reinforcement, dominates attention, then evaporates when the signals shift. The cycle is fast, volatile, and shallow. What is rewarded now is not endurance, but responsiveness. The result is a churn of figures who feel authoritative for a moment, then lose relevance when momentum slows. Their influence depends on attention. When it fades, so does their legitimacy. The figures history respects did not have momentum. They had grounding. They did not measure worth by immediate response. They did not adjust their position to remain visible. They were willing to be unseen for long periods because direction did not depend on being watched. This challenges a core assumption of modern culture. That visibility proves truth. That lack of affirmation signals failure. That authority must be obvious to be real. History suggests the opposite. What lasts is often what was least rewarded at the time. What endures is what did not need constant reinforcement to survive. What earns respect is what remained coherent. When applause was unavailable, this does not romanticize obscurity. It reframes authority. Authority does not come from being celebrated. It comes from being consistent, from holding a position long enough for others to feel its gravity, from trusting an internal signal even when external response lags behind. Most people never experience this kind of authority because it requires patience without feedback, conviction without reassurance, stability without applause. Those who do rarely look impressive in the moment. They look calm, slightly removed, uninterested in performance, willing to be out of sync, and over time the world adjusts around them, not because they demanded recognition, but because they never needed it. This is the kind of authority that survives the present. And this is why history, when it looks back, tends to respect the quiet ones. At its core, authority has very little to do with other people. This is difficult to accept in a world that constantly reflects us back to ourselves, where seriousness is inferred from reaction and respect is measured by response. But when the noise falls away, authority begins much earlier and much closer. It begins as an internal agreement, an agreement to act in alignment with what you believe to be true, regardless of immediate reward, an agreement to let values guide behavior even when doing so costs attention, approval, or comfort. When this agreement is intact, something stabilizes. You no longer need constant confirmation because your actions already make sense to you. Decisions do not require permission. They may still be informed by dialogue and feedback, but they are no longer organized around applause. This creates coherence. Thoughts, words, and behavior line up. There is less internal negotiation, less self-editing midstream, less fragmentation. You stop switching versions of yourself depending on audience. You respond from a consistent internal position. Others feel this, not consciously but instinctively. People are attuned to alignment. We trust signals that match. We sense when someone is not playing a role or managing perception in real time. This is where authority becomes visible, not as dominance or charisma, but as seriousness. The sense that someone is not trying to win the moment, that they are willing to stand by a position even when it is inconvenient. Respect grows from this stance, not admiration. Admiration is emotional and volatile. Respect is quieter. It is the recognition that someone's words are anchored, that disagreement with them feels meaningful rather than dismissive, that their presence carries weight without performance. Validation becomes optional. It can be appreciated, but it is no longer required. Praise does not inflate. Criticism does not destabilize. Feedback becomes information, not a verdict. Influence shifts accordingly. When you stop chasing reaction, people stop questioning your motive. When you stop performing for acceptance, intention becomes clearer. When you are no longer asking to be taken seriously, you often are. This is not because others change. It is because the dynamic does. You are no longer offering yourself for approval. You are offering a position, and positions invite engagement on different terms. Modern culture confuses admiration with authority. Admiration rises with novelty and fades just as quickly. Authority endures because it is structural, not emotional. People do not always agree with those they respect, but they listen more carefully. They respond more deliberately. They do not assume malleability. This is what authority actually is. Not control over others, but alignment within yourself. Once that alignment exists, external response becomes secondary. You can tolerate misunderstanding without rushing to correct it. You can allow silence without reading it as failure. You can let ideas mature without forcing circulation. Authority no longer needs defending because it is not being negotiated. It exists as an internal contract that remains valid regardless of reaction. And paradoxically, that is what makes it visible. People sense when someone is not dependent on them. They test less. They lean in more. They adjust, because authority, in its most durable form, is not something you demand. It is something you have already agreed to internally. Everything else is just reflection. In the end, nothing dramatic is required. No declaration, no withdrawal from the world, no sudden transformation. Validation will continue to appear exactly as it always has, offered casually, generously, designed to feel necessary. The systems that produce it are not going away, and they do not need to. The question was never whether validation exists. It is whether you allow it to decide who you are. Most people never consciously make this choice. They drift into it. Approval becomes a guide simply because it is available and reassuring. Over time, identity organizes itself around response, and authority is quietly traded for belonging. But this does not happen all at once. Authority is not seized. It is reclaimed, slowly, privately, often without anyone noticing. It returns in small moments, when you do not explain yourself unnecessarily, when you hold a position without checking the room, when you allow silence to pass without filling it, when you let an idea remain intact without needing it affirmed. None of this looks impressive from the outside. There is no applause for restraint, no metric for internal alignment, But something shifts, from asking to deciding, from performing to standing. The most powerful people rarely announce their power, because they are not trying to convince anyone of it. They move from an orientation that does not require reinforcement to remain stable. That orientation is available to anyone. It does not depend on status, audience, or recognition. It depends on willingness, the willingness to tolerate being unconfirmed, to remain coherent when response is absent, to let legitimacy come from within rather than from reaction. This is not rejection of feedback or withdrawal from life. It is discernment, knowing when validation is information and when it is noise. That choice is quiet, but it compounds. Over time, people respond differently to you, not because you changed tactics, but because you stopped offering yourself up for evaluation. Your presence becomes less reactive, your words more precise, your silence more deliberate. Authority emerges here, not as dominance, not as control, but as seriousness, as weight, as the sense that you are not easily moved by approval or disapproval. And once this shift happens, it does not need maintenance. It sustains itself. The world will continue to offer validation. Attention will always be available. Applause will always be tempting. The only question is whether you treat it as currency, or leave it where it belongs, outside, and walk forward with something steadier. Your agreement with yourself, that is the choice. And it is made not once, but quietly every day.